right, welcome. So thank you so much for having me to start off with. It's really nice to be here again. Always fun to come. I find that this is much more of a sort of family feel of a conference. I find that a lot of us in the industry go to maybe too many conferences every single year, but this is one that has become a staple of the community. I generally consider there to be about 4 to 5 ICS conferences that really make a difference in the discussions that take place every year, and I'm honored to be at one of them this year. So when I got asked to give the keynote, I typically understand that a keynote has at least 2 big requirements. Number one, you can't really talk about anything specific. It should be very lofty in nature and, of course, convey no point whatsoever. And number 2 is every year, conferences always run over their time slots. Every presentation runs over, and you blame the conference attendees. But really, it should be the keynote that automatically starts us off by running over schedule so that we can just get off bat to begin with. So I will try to keep my duties as a keynote. The topic here on exploring the ICS threat landscape, I think, is very important. On the point that we typically make a lot of investments every year in security. Now, we can complain about the challenges that we have. Maybe the engineering side isn't taking enough care of security. Maybe the IT side is focusing too much on security and not operations. We make these false challenges where we fight each other at times. But really, we have truly a common adversary. There are people who wake up in the morning and wish us harm and wish our infrastructure harm. And I will tell you, having been on both defense and offense over the years, from my previous time in the government, where I would say there's nothing better to see as the adversary side of the house than IT and OT not getting along. If your people aren't working together, there's no amount of patches, no amount of security monitoring, no amount of defenses you can put in place that the adversary won't bypass if you have that simple gap between your folks. What I see as a threat landscape is the actors and their capabilities, how they're impacting us, how they're getting into our infrastructure. And right now in the community, I don't think we have good visibility into what that is. So I want to start us off with, of course, a little Bobby comic. I wouldn't be myself if I didn't default to comics at least once. So I have up here little Bobby saying that we need more scalable, cloud-based threat intelligence analytics and automated big data endpoint security solutions. And Matt, of course, says, "You have no idea what you just said, do you?" And little Bobby says, "Nope, I read a list of words out loud and I got invited to speak at a security conference, and here I am." So that does sound about right in the community. We see year after year after year more folks talking on ICS security, which is good. Bottom line, it's good to see. But there are some times that we see a lot of quote-unquote experts talking about what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and sometimes there's conflicting messages. I like to be informed not by security experts, but by the threats. I want us to prioritize what we're doing in defenses, prioritize the investments we make based off what the actual threats to our infrastructure are. So that's my 2 takeaways for today. I want you to understand why the ICS threat landscape is unknown, and I want to give you a practical way to approach your own ICS threat landscape, which will be unique from other industries out there. So let's get rolling. One more little Bobby comic here. So we've got little Bobby going up to the CISO, and the CISO says, "I need you to ensure that no attacks occur." And little Bobby says, "Cool, what's the security budget?" And the CISO says, "Oh, no, we had to cut that out." And little Bobby says, "Well, I can assure you that we will never see any attacks." And I find that to be one of the issues in our community. We often have discussions in the US sector around why the energy sector sees a lot more cyber attacks than everybody else. Why is the energy sector the #1 target? And I would actually say that they're probably not. But we have a lot of regulations, a lot of security investments, a lot of focus, and sometimes the budgets to back them up to talk about and explore what threats are to energy infrastructure. If you go to a water utility, I know plenty of water utilities in the United States that have a $5,000 to $50,000 security budget for the entire year. And then we ask them, "Why aren't you seeing more threats?" And it's like, well, it's very difficult with $5,000 to $50,000 to actually invest in security and really invest in your people. But it's not a money thing alone. If it was fixed with money, we would have probably tackled it by now just by saving money, staying home, and focusing on the threats. But obviously, there's a culture issue as well. And I find that the idea of exploring the threat landscape can help fix a little bit of that culture. So let's start off with the problem. These numbers have become second nature to many in the industry. Every year, the United States ICS CERT puts out metrics. We even saw in the opening video them being referenced again, about 254, 240, 260 cyber attacks a year. Many people cite these numbers, but don't really understand where they come from and what they actually mean. So in my previous life, I spent time serving in the US intelligence community, which is super popular in Europe these days, always fun. But US intelligence community, where I spent time looking at and identifying nation states breaking into industrial control system environments. And so my team informed some of these metrics every year. And I became very familiar with where these large metrics that get quoted every year, every newspaper, every magazine talking about ICS. What is one thing that doesn't necessarily stand out is that 90+% of the metrics do not come from asset owners. Nobody, very few industries are actually reporting on their own cases. Very few are reporting about incidents that happen. Over 90% come from self-government entities identifying breaches, so the FBI, the NSA, the DHS. Some of them come from the defense industrial base as well. So every year they also talk about the sectors targeted. You always see energy as a main one. The one that we saw the last couple of years was critical manufacturing. So a lot of people were talking about critical manufacturing being a main target. Well, if you look at how we define critical manufacturing, it includes Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the manufacturers of airplanes and jets for the United States, who traditionally have extremely good security programs. So they find incidents and report them, and it sort of spikes up the data. But here's what's more important to me about what these metrics actually say. Every single year, if you go back and look at the different ICS CERT reports, every single year, the number one attack vector is unknown. Every year. The number two attack vector is spear phishing. And all of us will think about it and go, okay, that makes sense. I actually have a problem with that. How many email servers do we have in our SCADA environments? Not a whole lot. So spear phishing, to me, is a detection vector because it goes through the business network. And when we see attacks, it's usually the business networks and IT side of the house that sees the beginning of an intrusion. I really don't like the word attack here, but sees the beginning of an intrusion. And of course, they're seeing traditional things like spear phishing. In my experience, there's way more issues that evolve from VPN connections and remote connections to vendors and contractors than there are spear phishing emails. But every year, these are the things that guide how people do defense. The executive suite do investments based off of metrics like this, and we inform ourselves about how we should be doing defense. But if we don't understand how the attacks are even getting in, if we don't truly understand the method to which they got in, we are very unlikely to successfully clean it up. We can go move some data around, we can feel good about it, and at the end of the day, we can sit there and go, I did successfully to protect my ICS. But if you didn't know how it got in, you are very likely to get reinfected, re-impacted. So again, I would just note that we don't have the visibility that we need. So why is that? Well, if you look at traditional IT environments and traditional, what I'll call the threat intelligence community, which is an evolving word. Sometimes we see that to be a little bit buzzed out. Threat intelligence has become quite the hyped up word these days, but it actually has some value. And we look at the traditional threat intelligence community. The reason your big vendors, FireEye, Kaspersky, Trend Micro, McAfee, all these large vendors actually have insight into what the threat landscapes are and really understand threat intelligence is because of the people, your customers. They have sensors, they have endpoints, they have IDSs, they have firewalls, they have security mechanisms in your environments that report back out every time intrusions are seen, every time malware is stopped. And they get that data, and they sit and they analyze large data sets about what intrusions look like against you. We don't traditionally have that. We don't historically have that in industrial control system environments. So some of our best and brightest and most capable vendor community and the security community have never had the data to accurately be able to make the conclusions that we need them to make. And so, unfortunately, sometimes it feels that we're on our own. Now, I would say you actually have your peer community, and we have a lot of information sharing that can take place, but even that word has become a little bit weird, where people say, we want to do information sharing. Here's an IP address of malware I saw. That's not information sharing. That's just passing some technical data because it makes us feel like we're doing something. True information sharing is sitting down after an intrusion and saying, look, here's what happened. Here's all of the steps that we observed. Here's how we observed them. Here's the takeaways we had. Here's the lessons learned. Here's what we're doing after the fact to make ourselves better. That information sharing sometimes happens through the vendor community in IT. It does not happen right now in the vendor community in ICS. We have to encourage ourselves to find those threats. Now, of course, that leads to another point where I think we are prioritizing a lot of our security investments based off of IT technologies, IT methodologies. If we say spear phishing is a big deal in IT, we focus a lot on that. And to an extent, it gives us this very murky view of the ICS threat landscape. We look down the road, we see IT-OT convergence, we see the problems that are coming. We start seeing terms that we get inundated with, like IIoT, and what is that going to mean for the industry? How is the industry going to change in 10 years? Are safety and control devices being integrated together, where you have two functions in one device now? What does that mean for the engineering and the security? But the problem is sometimes if we take that traditional threat landscape and apply it just directly to IT, and ICS systems rather, what ends up happening is we end up making a very large turn when we actually see the real threat landscape. I mean, as an example, Dragonfly, so I'm going to use a lot of pictures today, Dragonfly. When it came to the Dragonfly campaign in HAVEX, the spear phishing portion made sense. The Waterhole attack made sense. But one of the things that I think caught a lot of people off guard is the Trojanized installers, that people were installing the malware directly into their environments. What was interesting to me about the choice of what vendors were targeted was not to what industry they are in. And this was a heated discussion. Well, is it targeting pharmaceuticals? No, it's targeting electric. No, it's targeting water. Well, really, nobody has the full view of the threat data. They don't have that historical information. You don't know. You can't take a partial view of the actor and the threat actor's targets and predict at what industry they're targeting. But what they're using does tell us something. The vendors they went after in the HAVEX campaign, a lot of times were related to VPN installers. So if you're targeting industrial control system environments that are traditionally segmented off from the internet, now we know there's some challenges there. John's going to talk at some point as well about internet-connected ICS. I constantly feel that friends should not allow ICS on the internet, but we'll get there. But when you look at the vendors that were targeted, those VPN connections, that made a lot of sense from an adversary's point of view. If it was a disconnected environment and you wanted to have remote access, why not embed in VPNs? Because automatically, you know there's going to be some remote capability. We saw the same thing with unique targeting methods in the Black Energy malware. I just love this picture. This is real, by the way. Mike Tyson has an energy drink called Black Energy. Makes you sort of view the malware a little differently from now on. But of course, it's not about the malware. When Black Energy was impacting energy companies in 2014, there were ICS modules involved, targeting different HMI vendors, Simplicity, Symantec, and Vantech. But when it came to targeting in the Ukraine, and we're going to talk about that this week as well, I've got some folks that are going to be sitting on the panel with me and talking about their lessons learned. But when it came to the Black Energy malware, a lot of people put focus on the malware. That's traditionally how we've trained ourselves. Malware in the ICS is bad. We're going to see malware, and it's going to cause damage. Malware is going to take down the power grid. No, it's not. I think that it is very naive to assume that malware is going to be responsible for power outages. Realistically, it's the human actor. Your threat is the human on the other side of the keyboard. Malware is just their capability to get there sometimes. But if you've got unauthenticated VPN access directly into a new environment running PowerShell all over your ICS, your adversary doesn't need malware. They can just use the ICS. And so when we talk about the human threat, there's, of course, the Sandworm team that we'll talk about later as well, that targeted the Ukraine power stations, also targeted a lot of different locations in Europe. I get asked all the time about attribution with Sandworm, and I usually completely avoid the topic of attribution. I say, I don't care. And I always get asked by reporters, was it Russia? I don't know. But it is interesting that I found this picture of someone writing on that sandworm from Dune. And I just wonder if you zoom in, if it'd be a very Putin-esque picture, like him riding a bear maybe. But it is interesting to see a lot of discussion around attribution and maybe not a lot of discussion about actually what we're doing for the security of it. Who cares? If it was Russia, what are we going to do about it? If it was US, what were we going to do about it in the TANs? I find that the security investments we make are where we can make differences. But here's, again, why it matters. We only have 3 or 4 case studies that get cited at every conference we go to. I go to a lot of security conferences. This year I've been home about 33 days in my house. It's been a lot of travel. And these are the same case studies that pop up everywhere. And because of the lack of real case studies from real incidents happening in your ICS and around the community, what ends up happening is this void forms. And this natural void matches with people's interest in ICS security. So because there's a lack of real case studies, and there's a lot of interest in doing the right thing with security, we all gravitate towards hyped up stories. And these hyped up stories fill our daily lives. So I've talked about them before, so I'm not going to belabor too much, but I threw up some of my favorites. We have the Illinois water hack of 2011, where a pump failed on the network. And everybody flipped out and said, oh, it was a Russian cyber attack because they found a Russian IP address on the logs. And it turned out it was just a contractor on vacation in St. Petersburg. We had the Chattanooga APT, Steven's here as well this week. Basically, there was a news report that said, look at all the attacks against ICS. And they stood up some honeypots. And the honeypot vendor was trying to say how amazing honeypots are, go figure, and said, look, we've got all these attacks and they're originating from Tennessee, Chattanooga. What it was Steven was preparing for a conference and was just scanning the internet for ICS that were connected. We have the Iran report, where Norse came out and published this big report saying, look, Iran is a threat to ICS, which everybody at first was like, okay, I could buy that. And they said, they're attacking infrastructure 500,000 times a year. Wait, what? Where are you getting these numbers from? And it turned out they stood up honeypots, and every TCP request they had, they documented as one attack. A lot of different things occurring, but here's where it's not so funny. That report, and I won't grandstand here too much, but that report's really interesting in the sense that it actually made it up to the National Security Council in the United States. The National Security Council was very concerned with the Iranian nuclear deal and very concerned with what might happen if they relieve sanctions. And so a cybersecurity company used our community, used ICS, to say the nuclear negotiations with Iran should fail. So the cybersecurity company made recommendations to national policy off of honeypot data that weren't actually ICS systems, it just had ICS-related ports open. That happens because we don't have real case studies. That happens because people really care in this industry, but we don't share real stories. The BTC pipeline, a good one to sort of tailor off with, sort of combined with the Israeli cyber attack one as well. BTC, they said that there was a cyber attack. In 2008, there actually was a physical explosion on the BTC pipeline. A news reporter came out and said 7 years later that it was a cyber attack, but at the time, the Turkish government said, it's the Kurdish extremists. And the Kurdish extremists said, yeah, it was us. And still somehow later, 7 years later, people were like, nah, it was Russia. It was a cyber attack. No evidence was ever presented. And of course, then there was an Israeli minister that was speaking at a conference that at the end of the conference said, we are right now undergoing the most severe cyber attack in Israel's history, which is kind of a big deal. And it's crippling our electric networks. And what he meant to say was it was crippling the regulation networks, nothing to do with the actual power grid. But CNN and major news sources ran headlines of major cyber attack against the Israeli power grid. We live in this world, and I'll sort of stop here to make the very simple point that our story of ICS is being written whether we're participating or not. People are going to write the story of ICS for generations to come and what it means for security and the investments that we're making, with or without us. I hope as a community we can get involved, actually share real stories and case studies so we don't get misled by security companies and sort of misplaced experts. But even things like malware in a German facility makes the news. To anybody in the community, I hope that this is nothing crazy. Conficker and a nuclear power plant. Okay, that's like one of 15 cases a year that people have to respond to. But because so many people are interested in it, it makes national headlines. Every year we see Conficker still as an issue in the ICS. I long for the day that I don't get phone calls for instant response for Conficker. Like, let's focus on some cool things outside of a worm back from 2008. This one, though, I thought was really interesting. If anybody can take a guess. Anybody got it? Anybody know which one this is? Audience participation. Yeah, good. Woo. All right. Iron Gate. There you go. Yeah, I thought that was clever. All right, Iron Gate. This one made a lot of news in the ICS community as well, because FireEye and the Mandiant team actually got some really good folks over there, and they put out this story about Iron Gate. And what the story said was there's somebody maybe, not necessarily, but maybe testing out malware and capabilities against industrial control environments. But I don't actually think that that's the case. I think it's completely fine hypothesis. I disagree with it, though, in the sense that it was a piece of malware written in Python, self-submitted by whoever wrote it. It never impacted anybody in the wild. It was a piece of malware that only impacted the virtual machine test equipment for Siemens PCS. It couldn't have infected anybody. And they even said that. FireEye came out and said, it is not active in the wild. And yet the entire community that I saw, maybe not everybody, but a lot of the security community was running around asking for indicators of compromise. And FireEye put out indicators of compromise, which I took a sort of offense to in the sense that nobody was compromised. How can you have indicators of compromise when nothing was done? But here's where, again, I think this is very interesting. Here's the VirusTotal view of where FireEye found this. So FireEye didn't get alerted by a vendor. They didn't get alerted by a customer. They didn't find the malware running somewhere. They just looked on VirusTotal intelligence and looked for malware that had been submitted. But here's the point I want to make very clearly before we move on. The first submission of this malware was 2014. It was called SCADA.exe. It had a replay, sort of man-in-the-middle effect, and it was very obviously malicious. SCADA.exe written in Python with weird file paths and weird DLLs. And 0 of the vendors alerted on it being malicious. 2 years later, FireEye found it, and then people started alerting on it after it became public. I am extremely excited about anybody making security investments in their ICS, whether it's antivirus or training their people. But we gotta stop viewing things as single silver bullets. I'm actually not a huge fan of antivirus in the ICS anyway, talk about that offline, but it's not the solution. These vendors who have traditionally done a very good job, and they're amazing professionals who are absolutely good at what they do, have historically not understood what industrial control systems are. They don't understand what ICS malware looks like. One of my working hypotheses is the fact that we have had 15, 20 years of vendors looking for malware. None of them have been looking for ICS malware. So while we have the big 3 out there, that S-Word, Havex, and Black Energy 2, I would pontificate that we probably actually have a lot of other samples of ICS-tailored malware that just hasn't been caught because antivirus isn't even seeing SCADA.exe. And so, of course, we kind of can't do this. We aren't afforded the opportunity to just ignore the problems, especially as that IT-OT convergence continues. We are up against very significant challenges. We all know that. And the only way that we get better at this is understanding our own personal threat landscape. So let's talk about how to do that. So one more Little Bobby comment here. Little Bobby says, what makes control software on an iPad so bad? And Matt says, look, remotely viewing the process, it's not ideal, but remote control, that allows others to use it maliciously. And he starts freaking out, and Matt goes, what's wrong? Little Bobby says, oh, I left my iPad in the restaurant. And I think that says a lot about our transient devices in the community sometimes. So if you remember from last year, for those of you that were here last year, I presented on the ICS cyber kill chain. It's a paper I wrote with Mike Asante looking at the different steps an adversary has to go through to achieve the type of attacks we're most concerned with in ICS. Not just the typical break in and do reconnaissance and weaponization and actions on objectives, but what do they have to do once they're there? One substation in one part of Sweden is completely different than one substation in a different part of Sweden. Different integration, different vendors, different process. There's not a scalable attack that works on everything. So if you're an adversary that wants to bring down infrastructure, you do have to tailor your attack to some level on that infrastructure. So this is the model to step through what an attack looks. Now, if we take that and combine it with the bow tie model, the bow tie model was a model that Brian Owen presented here last year from OSI Soft, looking at a safety model. So bow tie is a safety process, not security related, and they adapted it for security, saying, okay, if we think about the threat and the impact, what can we do before the breach, before the incident, to defend against the threat, and after the breach, what can we do to reduce the impact? So we'll just categorize things into 2 buckets of data. And they started doing that against the kill chain. They said at every level, what are things we could do on either side of the scale here? And then we take that and combine it with the sliding scale of cybersecurity. So there's a lot of models, all very quickly. I'll show it all at once coming up. But the sliding scale of cybersecurity is a paper I wrote looking at the investments you can make in security. I get very tired of people telling me that they're security experts, or I do cybersecurity. What does that mean? Like, what do you actually do on a day-to-day basis? I do cyber. That's not a thing. You actually have to have a job role. There are 5 things that you can do, in my opinion. You can focus on the architecture, building out a better ICS to begin with, building security into the ICS. Next, you can focus on the passive defenses. What are the firewalls, antivirus, endpoint security solutions, IPSs? What can I put that when I go home and sleep at night, it still does something for me on the network? One step above that is that active defense. How do I put humans back into the loop? How do I put humans monitoring and looking for threats and being proactive, being active in how we defend? Intelligence, very classical understanding of taking data and information and turning it into intelligence. And then lastly, offense. I would position to you that it is not a good idea to do offense. I keep seeing this discussion on hack back. And I think it's very naive when I see companies who don't do security well that think they're going to do offense well, like it's just so much easier. But it's not actually going to contribute to anything. And this is a key point of the scale here. All of the investment that you should be making that actually gives you a good return on your investment is on the left-hand side of the scale. You should be moving across. You shouldn't build out a big security operations center for your ICS if you don't have patches, if you don't have firewalls, if you don't have logs. I see a lot of companies investing in cyber threat intelligence, which is okay, but then I go and ask, how much logs do you have? Do you have 60 days? Do you have 180 days? And they go, oh, we have 24 hours of logs. Like, why are you doing intelligence then? There's investments that help you later on. So let's take this in consideration of what I want you to do. And this is what I want you to pay attention to for the rest of the conference. When I hear these conference presentations throughout the week, and when I see the abstracts, there's some very exciting talks. And all of them are going to give you different views into how you can do defense a little bit better. So when you leave here, I want you to leave with the understanding that we do need to be taking an active approach. And so I put a hunter up on the screen here because I do feel that most of us should be going back and taking a threat hunting styled approach. Get away from what the security dribble is. Forget the policies and the firewall logs and thinking about individual tasks, and take an approach of looking into your ICS to try to hunt down those threats. Assume compromise and work towards finding those threats. When you do that, I want you to map out what you find for your environment. The incidents that you see in your environment are going to be different than incidents the other rest of the community sees. So map out against those 3 models what those incidents are. And then prioritize. Because everybody always talks about the 20 security controls or the 30 things you should do. Realistically, you've got time and resources for 4. There's probably about 4 things that you can actually do at any given time. And depending on your organization, it might be your entire career trying to do 4 big things at your company. So prioritize across all of the incidents that you see throughout the year, mapped against those 3 models, and pick out the common themes. What What are the common attack vectors for you? What are the common security controls that if you would have put them into place would help mitigate multiple attacks? And what that ultimately should look like is this. You'll take the ICS cyber kill chain and map it against the incidents you'll see. At every single level of that kill chain, I want you to figure out what could you be doing as an architecture change, as a passive defense change, as an active defense change. You could ignore intel and offense until you start getting those three. And really, you should never do offense. Then break out at every single layer what those are and categorize them on the bow tie model. Figure out what's a proactive approach in defending ahead of time, and figure out what helps you reduce the impact. When you do this for all of your incidents, you will have a true understanding of your threat landscape. You will see what's impacting you. You will see what the common attack vectors are, what the common methodologies, what the defenses that you could be putting into place look like. And you will have a very tailored view. And I've done this a number of times. It's very effective to stand up in front of executives and abstract out all the security jargon. Talk to engineering and abstract out all the we saw 30,000 alerts and say, look, in review of all the things that cost us money or impacted us this year, here are the 4 things that would have reduced a lot of the risk we saw. Here are the 4 things that would have helped us based on the common themes of what we saw. That is much more impactful than any of your consultants coming in. Now, I like consultants. I like security vendors. I am a dirty vendor these days. But we need to take a really good view on what we have. So let's take a look at HAVEX very quickly here in the Dragonfly campaign. If we look at stage 1 and we just say, all right, from stage 1, the command and control. So at the command and control level, from an architecture defense perspective, 2-form authentication on the VPNs would have made a heck of a lot of difference. It would have been very difficult for the adversaries to do what they did for command and control if there was 2-form authentication. Traditionally, that's where people would have stopped. Security community goes, cool, 2-form authentication, we're done. No, keep going. Say from an impact reduction, how about limiting new domains? If we've never seen this weird domain before, we don't have to block it. We don't have to upset people, God forbid. But let's maybe limit it. Is it a completely new domain we've never seen before? Maybe we don't want to allow them to move files in and out of our network if we've never seen that domain. One of the HAVEX domains, and I apologize if this is a little profane, but it's one of them. One of the HAVEX domains was sexydisneyprincesses.com. No ICS should be going to sexydisneyprincesses.com. I would very much feel concerned if any of you went to sexydisneyprincesses.com, but definitely not your ICS. From a passive defense, that DNS filtering could have impacted. From a passive defense to impact reduction, time windows. If you know that your ICS doesn't do updates outside of a maintenance window, why allow external IP addresses to come in and do updates at any given time? Understand the life cycle of your ICS and the changes that occur depending on those life cycles. From an active defense perspective, network security monitoring. Identifying abnormalities in your network would have most certainly given you an understanding before the impact that something was occurring. And then, of course, from the impact reduction, the incident response aspect, and actually understanding indicators of compromise. That would have been very useful for scoping the infection inside of your environment. So just from one step, command and control, from one case study, we already see that we've got 6 different controls. Again, do that for the incidents you see throughout the year. It's not easy, but it can be fun even, sitting down with your security team and discussing what it would have actually been in your environment. What are the actual controls you could have put in place? Prioritize those investments, and I assure you that you will have an actual tailored approach to your threat landscape and how you can do defense. And sort of as we start wrapping up here and kicking off the rest of the conference, I want to note that we are most certainly all sort of eating from the same doggy bowl. And when it comes to ICS security, it's important to realize we are part of the community. Now, I will tell you, this is a little bit of a stretch for a slide. I just really loved this picture and wanted to figure out a way to fit it in my presentation. But I like the doggy bowl reference. I think that was okay. We are a community. And too often we act like we're not. We talk about the oil and gas sector. We talk about energy. We talk about manufacturing. Our ICS is different. The adversaries have to take a different approach, but we're the same community. And it's conferences like this that help us realize that. It's conferences like this where you'll meet the same people in your industry and then different people that have the exact same problems that you've been coming up against. So as a recap and as we start closing out for questions, we got little Bobby here as well, talking about squirrels and the power grid. But when it comes to what we're trying to accomplish here this 2 days, try not to lose the zeal that you're going to have here. It happens every security conference. You sit around, you have a couple beers, you go out drinking at 3 o'clock in the morning, you come keynote the next day and your voice is gone. You realize that you've got a lot of friends and peers, and you get really excited about security again. You remember why you got involved in security in the first point. It happens every conference. Everybody gets excited. And then something happens about 2 weeks after the conference, and it's just business as usual again. Try not to let that happen. And really, to do that, pick out the 2 or 3 things, the 2 or 3 abstracts that stand out to you, and figure out how you're going to leverage those when you go back. If you're not taking something with you to do, to make actionable, it'll just be another security conference with a lot of beer. So with that, I think I'm running out of time, so we can open it up to questions. Perfect.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to give you a cure that is much easier to
thank
find
you. Yeah, thank you.
than a cure for malicious code in ICS. I wish it was that simple.
I blame Aaron. Where's Aaron? He's probably not even here this morning. But, yeah.
Yeah? All right. So we have, first of all, you can look at this left side or right side, whatever you choose,
of course,
depending on the direction. What do you believe is little Bobby's greatest concerns? And it's all from digital Pearl Harbor to squirrels. Squirrels is the most, the most worrisome thing in little Bobby's life, apparently.
I'm more interested and concerned about the person that put Guccifer turns to ICS. All right.
Okay.
We have some conversation to have this week, people, so it'll be fun.
So we do have some questions for you, I think.
Oh, I think it's off on the side.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. No, that's the first one. Yeah, why is attribution so important for people? Is that because they have military background, or why do they need to point fingers?
Yeah, so I actually don't think it's just a military problem. I get that there's some challenges when people in the government transition out of the government, and they focus on challenges that they were concerned with while in the government. But I found that executives care far more about attribution than any military person I've seen. So, 1 second. Much better. All right, so with attribution, I ran my class yesterday through this drill, but I want to do it with everybody here. So to my class, apologize, and I'll just need you to hang in for a moment. If I tell you that China is in your network, what are they likely looking for? I always love these European audiences. So interactive, so talkative. IP. All right, so China's in your network, maybe looking for IP. If Russia's in your network or a Russian-based group, what might they be doing? What might they be looking for? Do what? What? Yeah, it could be the same, but what else? And some other people? Do what? Files. Yeah, it could be, so we usually get comments like cybercrime, maybe military planning. If the US is in your network, what are they looking for, potentially? Russia, yeah. Usually I would say the threat actors that are related to US usually get tagged as caring about spying on politicians or maybe counterterrorism. And we could do this drill with any country. And if we had maybe an audience that wanted to participate, no, I'm kidding. You would see that the answers are very varied. My point in doing this, though, is all of that is bias. It's silly to go through that exercise because every country rather, has teams that do all those things. So we get focused on the campaigns that we hear about. We hear a lot about China stealing intellectual property, so we think China, we think intellectual property. They've got other teams. The US has intellectual property teams. The Russians have intellectual property teams. Everybody does everything. So attribution at a tactical level, in my opinion, biases the way you look at the data. It hurts you. You go in looking for actors stealing intellectual property because you're thinking China, and you completely miss the Chinese-based teams, even if you're right, doing completely other activity. It hurts you to think about attribution. At the strategic level, executives tend to care. Now, there was one point in my career that I would say attribution might be helpful at the strategic level. Maybe we're gonna make different business choices on who we do business with based on that. But I've actually seen attribution be less and less useful over the years, even as attribution has become more and more possible. It's become very doable to actually get to attribution. But it's become less useful because as a community, we fight about it so much. And I think this is worth calling out, even though I don't think it's a very popular opinion. People who weren't involved in the incident response, people who weren't involved in the attribution, should be very careful to be coming out in national media, Twitter or anywhere else, saying why the attribution is wrong, why they know better,